In the glittering ballroom of the Kensington estate, chandeliers sparkled like stars above a crowd of the city's wealthiest families. The music of a live orchestra filled the air, violins swelling as if the night itself demanded elegance. Waiters in white gloves floated between tables, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres that shimmered like jewels on silver trays. Tonight wasn't just another charity gala. It was an exhibition of wealth and pride for the Kensington family, one of the most influential dynasties in town. Standing at the center of it all was Richard Kensington, a tall, silver-haired millionaire with a booming voice that commanded attention. He had spent decades building an empire and, with it, a reputation for arrogance. Richard loved nothing more than to remind people of his status. Beside him stood his son, Daniel, a polite young man in his late 20s who often cringed at his father's cruel jokes but rarely spoke against him. At the edge of the room, unnoticed by most, was Alicia, a black maid hired only for the evening. Dressed in a plain uniform, she moved quietly, collecting empty glasses and straightening linens. But her eyes held a quiet strength, one that seemed out of place among the servants. Every now and then, she paused to glance at the dancers twirling across the polished floor, her expression unreadable. It was then, during a lull in the music, that Richard's mocking voice rang out, echoing across the ballroom. "You know," he laughed loudly, raising his glass, "if any woman here can dance a proper waltz with my son, she can have his hand in marriage." The crowd erupted with laughter. It was clearly a joke, his way of mocking Daniel's single status and flaunting his own wealth. Some ladies giggled and playfully fanned themselves, while others whispered, eager to be noticed. But Richard's sharp eyes suddenly fell on Alicia, who was just passing by with a tray. He smirked. "Even you, maid," he sneered, pointing at her with cruel amusement. "Do you dare try? Can you even dance a step without tripping over yourself?" The room fell into silence. All eyes turned to Alicia, who froze in place. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. She set down the tray slowly, her gaze steady as she looked back at Richard. For the first time that night, a spark lit in her eyes. "Sir," she said softly but firmly, "you may regret asking that." A hush spread across the ballroom. Guests leaned in, shocked that a maid had dared to answer back. Richard Kensington's grin widened. He loved a spectacle. "Oh, is that so?" he chuckled, raising his brow. "Well then, show us. Dance with my son. Let's give these people something to laugh about." Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment. He glanced at Alicia, his voice low. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, aware of his father's cruelty. But Alicia only lifted her chin, her expression calm, almost fearless. The orchestra conductor looked uncertain, but Richard waved his hand grandly. "Play. Let's see what our little maid can do." The violins stirred again, a graceful melody filling the room. Alicia stepped forward, her plain shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. For a moment, the room held its breath, expecting disaster. But then she moved. Her body flowed like water, every step measured, every turn perfect. She glided across the floor with Daniel as if she had been born for this very moment. The crowd gasped. This was no fumbling attempt. This was mastery. Daniel quickly realized he wasn't leading, she was guiding him with ease, subtly correcting his posture, spinning gracefully, her movements flawless. He stared at her in awe, struggling to keep up, but she made even his missteps look intentional. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "She dances beautifully," one woman exclaimed. "Look at her form. Perfect frame. Perfect timing." Another guest muttered, "This is no ordinary maid." Richard's smug expression faltered as murmurs of admiration replaced laughter. His hand tightened around his glass. He hadn't expected her to last even a few seconds, let alone captivate the entire room. When the music swelled to its climax, Alicia spun elegantly, landing in Daniel's arms with flawless precision. The room erupted in applause, the sound crashing against the walls like thunder. Even the musicians seemed carried away, bowing their instruments with extra fervor. Alicia stepped back gracefully, her breathing steady. She lowered her gaze, not in shame, but in quiet dignity. For a moment, no one spoke, until Daniel did. "That," he said softly, still staring at her in wonder, "was the most extraordinary dance I've ever experienced." The crowd cheered again, some even rising to their feet. But Richard's jaw tightened, his pride wounded in front of his entire circle of influence. "Who are you?" he demanded harshly, his voice cutting through the applause. "No maid dances like that." Alicia's eyes met his, calm but unyielding. "I wasn't always a maid, sir," she replied. "Once, I was a champion." Gasps echoed across the ballroom like a wave crashing over the crowd. "A champion?" People leaned closer, whispers buzzing like bees. The idea that the maid before them once held such a title seemed unthinkable. Richard scoffed, trying to regain control. "A champion?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "In what world? Perhaps in some local fair? Or in your imagination?" His mocking laugh rippled through the room, though weaker now, lacking the confidence it carried before. Alicia didn't flinch. She clasped her hands in front of her, speaking with quiet dignity. "The National Dance Association. Waltz, foxtrot, tango. My partner, and I won more than one title before life changed." Her voice wavered only slightly on the last words, but she held her ground. Daniel stared at her, stunned. He had felt the truth in her steps. No amateur could have moved the way she did. "She's telling the truth," he said firmly, cutting through his father's ridicule. "You saw it, everyone saw it." Several guests nodded, voices rising in agreement. "She's exceptional," one man said. "That was championship technique," a woman whispered, her eyes alight. Richard's pride bristled. The spotlight that was meant to humiliate a servant had turned against him, and he could feel the crowd slipping from his control. He raised his hand sharply. "Enough," he barked. "Even if what you claim is true, your place is here, serving drinks, not on my ballroom floor." A silence followed, tense and uncomfortable. Alicia gave a small nod, accepting his attempt to dismiss her, but her eyes still burned with quiet fire. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "That's what life is now. But you should know this. Talent and dignity don't vanish just because someone wears a uniform." The words landed heavy, like stones dropped in still water. Some of the guests looked away, ashamed at how they had laughed before. Richard forced a cold smile. "Well, perhaps you fooled a few with your little display. But it changes nothing." He turned to Daniel with a sneer. "Don't forget, son, this was a joke. You don't marry the help because she knows a few steps." Daniel's jaw tightened, a rare flash of defiance in his eyes. He glanced at Alicia, then back at his father. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "jokes reveal more truth than intended." The room froze at his words. Richard's face darkened, but before he could speak, the orchestra, sensing tension, began another waltz to ease the atmosphere. Yet all eyes stayed fixed on the unlikely pair standing at the center, the maid who had once been a champion, and the son who seemed to see her in a way no one else did. The ballroom buzzed with unease. The music played, but few returned to the floor. Instead, eyes kept drifting back to Alicia and Daniel, as though everyone sensed the night had shifted into something far more meaningful than a simple gala. Daniel took a slow breath, then turned to her. "Would you dance again?" he asked gently, ignoring the stares. His voice wasn't commanding like his father's. It carried respect, a quiet request rather than an order. Alicia hesitated, her hands tightening around the folds of her apron. She wasn't supposed to be the center of anything. She was there to serve, not shine. Yet the yearning in her heart stirred. She hadn't felt music call to her like this in years, not since she left behind the glittering lights of competition for a life shadowed by hardship. Finally, she nodded. "One more," she whispered. The orchestra swelled, violins lifting into a hauntingly beautiful melody. Daniel extended his hand, and she placed hers gently in his. The crowd parted, creating space. This time, the dance was not mockery, not challenge. It was something else entirely. Their movements blended with ease. Though Daniel wasn't as skilled, he followed her lead, his natural grace surprising even himself. Step after step, Their bodies moved in unison, as if the music belonged to them alone. Guests leaned forward, captivated. There was a softness in the way Daniel looked at her, as though he saw not a maid, not even a champion, but a woman, strong, graceful, and unbreakable. Richard's hand tightened on his cane, fury rising. He could feel the attention slipping away from him. This was supposed to be his night, his triumph, his circle of influence bowing to his power. Instead, they were marveling at a servant dancing with his heir. The final note of the waltz rang out like a bell. Daniel lowered Alicia with a gentle dip, their eyes locking for a moment that felt suspended in time. Applause thundered again, louder, longer, impossible to ignore. Some guests even whistled, while others rose to their feet in ovation. Alicia's cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment, but from a long-forgotten joy she thought she'd buried forever. When Daniel helped her stand upright again, he leaned close, his voice just for her. "You don't belong in the shadows." Richard's voice cut like a whip. "Enough," he thundered, his face crimson. The applause stilled. "This is my home, my event, and I will not have it turned into a circus by some servant pretending to be something she is not." The silence was heavy. And yet, as Alicia looked into Daniel's eyes, she realized the truth. Something inside her had already awakened, and there was no going back. The silence in the ballroom thickened, suffocating. Guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalty to Richard Kensington's wealth and the undeniable beauty they had just witnessed. No one dared speak, but the admiration in their eyes betrayed them. Alicia drew in a steady breath. She could have bowed her head and stepped back into the shadows, retreating to her role as if none of this had ever happened. That would have been easier, safer. But something deep inside refused to bend. Not anymore. "Sir," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the room. "I never pretended to be anything. I simply danced." A ripple went through the crowd. It wasn't defiance shouted in anger. It was dignity spoken in truth. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Father, you mocked her. You challenged her. And she answered. Not with words, but with grace. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it." He looked around, and murmurs of agreement rose again. Heads nodded, eyes softened toward Alicia. Richard's pride burned like fire. For decades, he had controlled every narrative in this house, every whisper of respect. And now, in front of his own son and half the city's elite, a maid threatened that control. "You speak out of turn, Daniel," Richard snapped. "This woman doesn't belong in our world." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Maybe our world is the problem," he muttered, almost too quiet for others to hear. Alicia's eyes flickered toward him, startled by his words, by the unguarded honesty in them. For a heartbeat, she saw not the heir to a fortune, but a man longing to break free from the same gilded cage that kept her pressed beneath his father's heel. Richard, sensing his grip slipping further, tried to laugh it off. "Fine," he barked. "If you all think this is so remarkable, let's make it interesting." He raised his glass like a judge delivering a verdict. "Dance again, Maid. But this time, not with my son, with me." Gasps rang out. The challenge was cruel, calculated. He wasn't offering a dance, he was setting a trap. If she refused, she'd look cowardly. If she accepted and faltered, he would win back his pride before everyone. Alicia's chest tightened. She looked at the man before her, powerful, arrogant, daring her to step into his game. Every instinct warned her it was dangerous. Yet she remembered the weight of her own words. Talent and dignity don't vanish with a uniform. Her lips curved, not in a smile, but in quiet resolve. "As you wish," she said, her voice steady. The orchestra tensed, bows hovering over strings, waiting for the signal. Guests leaned forward, breathless. For the first time all evening, Richard looked uncertain, because deep down, he already suspected the truth. The orchestra struck the first note, low and steady, like a warning. All eyes locked onto the unlikely pair stepping into the center of the ballroom. Richard Kensington, towering, proud, his every move meant to dominate, and Alicia, calm yet resolute, her presence radiating a strength that no uniform could hide. He seized her hand a little too roughly, his grip meant to remind her of her place. "Try to keep up," he muttered, his smile sharp as glass. But when the music swelled, something shifted. Richard attempted to lead, stomping through the steps with rigid control, but Alicia moved with effortless precision. Her body anticipated every beat, her frame unyielding, guiding him without anyone noticing. To the audience, it appeared as if Richard was dancing flawlessly, but in truth, he was being carried by her mastery. Murmurs began to ripple again. "Look at her footwork," whispered a woman near the front. "She's correcting him without making it obvious." A gentleman added, "She's saving him from embarrassment, and he doesn't even realize it." Richard's face tightened as the realization dawned. His steps felt clumsy compared to hers. He tried to quicken the pace, to overpower her, but Alicia adjusted seamlessly, matching his force with grace, turning his blunders into brilliance. The harder he tried to humiliate her, the more radiant she became. Daniel watched from the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding. He could see his father unraveling, the fury in Richard's eyes as control slipped through his fingers. Yet he also saw Alicia's quiet defiance, her strength shining in every measured step. She wasn't just dancing, she was reclaiming the dignity his father had tried to strip away. The music rose, violins crying out in a powerful crescendo. Richard pulled her into a spin meant to throw her off balance, but Alicia flowed through it with breathtaking elegance, turning the move into a flawless flourish that made the crowd gasp in awe. Applause broke out mid-dance, something unheard of in such a formal setting. Richard's pride shattered under the weight of it. By the time the final chord struck, Alicia released his hand and stepped back gracefully, her breathing steady, her chin lifted high. The ballroom erupted. Cheers, claps, even shouts of admiration filled the air. People rose to their feet, many staring not at Richard but at the maid who had just outshone him in front of his own empire. Richard's face was crimson, his chest heaving. For the first time in years, he looked small, his power cracked open for all to see. Alicia bowed slightly, not in submission, but as a champion greeting her audience. And when she lifted her gaze, it was Daniel she searched for, not Richard. The applause thundered through the hall, refusing to fade. Guests stood shoulder to shoulder, clapping, whistling, even shouting her name. "Bravo!" someone cried. Another guest exclaimed, "That was the finest waltz I've seen in years." Alicia lowered her eyes briefly, trying to hide the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. For so long, she had lived unseen, a shadow at the edge of rooms like this. And now, she was the light everyone couldn't look away from. Richard, however, stood frozen. His hand trembled as it clenched the head of his cane. This night, which had begun as a showcase of his power, had turned into his humiliation. Rage boiled in him, but he could not shout it away. The truth was written too clearly in every eye that looked at her, not him. Daniel stepped forward, the first to break the moment. He moved directly to Alicia's side and took her hand, lifting it high before the crowd. His voice rang with certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present not just a maid, but a champion." The room erupted again, louder than before. Alicia's cheeks burned, but her heart surged with gratitude toward him. No one had ever spoken for her like that, not since her partner had walked away years ago, leaving her alone in more ways than one. Richard's fury snapped. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice raw. "You will not parade her around as though she belongs in this family. She is a servant, Daniel. A servant." The words sliced the air, silencing the crowd. All eyes flicked between father and son, sensing the storm that had been long in the making. Daniel didn't flinch. "No, father," he said firmly, his voice steady, strong. "She is more than you ever gave her credit for. More than you've given anyone credit for." His grip tightened around Alicia's hand. "And I would be honored to dance with her again, tonight, tomorrow, or for the rest of my life." Gasps spread like wildfire. Some guests smiled in awe, others whispered furiously, but all of them felt the weight of his declaration. Alicia's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, not here, not tonight. Her heart pounded as her eyes searched his, looking for any hint of hesitation. But Daniel's gaze was unwavering, filled with sincerity. Richard's face twisted in rage, his voice breaking. "You would throw away your name, your legacy for her?" Daniel's reply came, without pause. "If that's what it takes to live with dignity and truth, then yes." The ballroom held its breath. For the first time, Richard Kensington had been defied not only by a maid, but by his own son. The room was still, as though the chandeliers themselves had frozen in mid-glow. Richard's face burned crimson, his pride collapsing under the weight of his son's words. For a man who had spent his entire life demanding obedience, nothing cut deeper than public defiance. He slammed his cane against the floor, the sound echoing like thunder. "You are a fool, Daniel. You disgrace this family, this name. I will not allow it." But Daniel stood tall, his voice calm, unshaken. "It isn't your choice anymore, father. You can control fortunes, estates, and reputations, but you cannot control my heart." He turned, his eyes finding Alicia's again. "And my heart has chosen her." Gasps spread like fire through the crowd. Some guests murmured in disapproval, but many more smiled, touched by the raw honesty of his words. Applause began softly from one corner of the room, then grew, rising in waves as guests stood, one by one, clapping, not for Richard, but for Daniel and Alicia. Alicia felt her chest tighten, tears brimming in her eyes. She had spent years hiding from the world, carrying the weight of lost dreams and broken promises. And yet, tonight, in the most unlikely of places, she was being seen, truly seen for who she was. Richard, trembling with fury, turned to leave, but the sound of the applause followed him like a storm he could not escape. His empire was intact, but his authority over hearts and minds had crumbled. When the last of his footsteps faded, Daniel reached for Alicia's hand once more. "I meant every word," he whispered. "You don't have to answer now, but would you let me prove it to you?" Alicia stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and hope. Slowly, she nodded, her voice breaking but steady. "Yes, but only if you can keep up with me on the dance floor." Daniel laughed softly, relief and joy lighting his features. "Then I'll learn every step." The orchestra, sensing the moment, began to play again, a gentle, hopeful melody that filled the grand hall. Guests circled around as Daniel and Alicia stepped once more onto the floor, not as a joke, not as a servant and heir, but as two souls daring to rewrite their story. They moved together, not perfectly, but beautifully, each step a promise, each turn a defiance of everything that tried to keep them apart. And as the music soared, Alicia felt something she hadn't in years, not just the thrill of the dance, but the certainty that, somehow, she had found her place again. In that moment, surrounded by applause and music, the maid was no longer invisible. She was a champion once more, and perhaps something even greater.